Hello. I think it worked. I think it's on. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you. See lots of good friends in the audience, and I'm very pleased to welcome all of you here. I'm Marcy Driscoll, Dean of the College of Education. I know we have a lot of folks here from several different colleges, and I welcome all of you to this special lecture series to welcome our guest, Dr. Sara Goldrick-Rab. So I want to tell you a little bit about her. I went onto her website and Wikipedia, a few other sources, to pull out a couple of interesting tidbits about her, as well as the usual things. So Dr. Sara Goldrick-Rab is Professor of Higher Education and Sociology at Temple University, which is in Philadelphia, if you don't know. She received her doctorate in sociology from the University of Pennsylvania in 2004, and then immediately accepted a position at the University of Wisconsin-Madison with the intent to make Wisconsin colleges more affordable and accessible. Her scholarship focuses on policies that aim to reduce socioeconomic and racial inequalities, with a particular emphasis on financial aid and community colleges. So she knows a lot about Florida. We were talking just before the start of today's lecture, and she was telling me about having come to Tallahassee previously and interviewed then President T.K. Wetherill, who was president of Tallahassee Community College at the time. So she knows a lot about us. Dr. Goldrick-Rab founded the Wisconsin Harvesting Opportunities for Post-Secondary Education, otherwise known as the HOPE Lab, in May 2014 to test the efficacy of college affordability programs. The lab received funding from the Great Lakes Higher Education Corporation, Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, the Kresge Foundation, Lumina Foundation, and others. She moved to Temple in 2016. Her commitment to scholar activism is evident not only in her writing, but also in her extensive service to local, state, and national communities, working directly with governors and state legislators to craft policies to make college more affordable. She also collaborates with nonprofit organizations seeking to examine the effects of their practices and policies and providing technical assistance to congressional staff, think tanks, and membership organizations throughout Washington, D.C. She's a busy lady and spends a lot of time on the road. Dr. Goldrick-Rab is 10th on the list of the top 200 public scholars in education that was produced and released earlier this year by Rick Hess. And if you don't know him, I suggest taking a look at some of his work as well, acknowledging the public impact of the work being carried out by education researchers. She's very active on Twitter, and I am now a loyal follower. But I want to particularly quote something that I found on her website, which I think gives you a really good idea of the kind of person that she is and the kind of work that she's doing. She says, "I'm no longer accepting the things I cannot change. I'm changing the things I cannot accept." Please join me in welcoming Dr. Goldrick-Rab to Florida State University.
Hey. Good afternoon, and thank you so much for that introduction. And I first want to acknowledge the quote is actually from Angela Davis, one of my heroes. And she is also on the road right now giving a tour of her own, and I have yet to cross paths with her, but I have my fingers crossed. It's great to be here. I really appreciated the invitation. As was stated, I have not been here in a long time, but I have been here before. The last time I was here, I was a graduate student in the middle of my program, and I was working on a book that was a 6-state study of the effects of welfare reform, the 96 welfare reform, on college access. And I'm sure those of you who look beyond higher education know that this state has been a national leader in some regards for how it has altered social policies as well as educational policies. So this was a really interesting place to visit and to hear from your state legislators how they believed the poor should be advanced in society. In this case, what they were telling me about was how we ought to further the movement into work rather than into higher education. That was the start of my interest in these questions about equitable access to college and who gets the opportunity to complete degrees. And I, since that time, really delved into work on financial aid. You will see, though, as we get towards the end of the talk, that I'm in many ways now, at this point in my career, returning to those issues of social policies and their effects on higher ed. I'm going to be drawing today primarily from this book that I recently released, and I want you all, especially the students in the room, to know that I conducted this research with a very large team. It's a team that has become known under the name of the Wisconsin Hope Lab, but the Hope Lab didn't even exist at the time we began. We were basically a motley crew of graduate students and undergrads and staff members who were thinking that something was going on when it came to paying for college, and we were all kind of frustrated with the system and wanted to understand it better. In all, over the course of the study that I'm going to describe, 200 people contributed to this research study, just on the research team alone, in addition to the 3,000 students who I'll be talking about today who also, of course, assisted us. And that's where I want to start. I want to start with the students. I think that one of the reasons that we haven't made more progress in higher education policy these days is that we tend to start with things other than the students, people other than the students. The policies that we have reflect a variety of interests. Some of them, frankly, come from us researchers, us faculty. You know, we have our own theories and hypotheses grounded in things that we have read and experienced. They may be kind of distant, however, from the realities of today's students. And so I'll start with a young woman who I met for the first time in the fall of 2008. Her name is Chloe Johnson. That's a pseudonym, of course, but she's a real person who is currently in her mid-20s. Actually spent a fair bit of time living in Tampa in the last 5 years. Chloe Johnson and I met at one of Wisconsin's technical colleges. They're not dissimilar to your community colleges here. They're places that people go not only to try to get an associate degree that will lead to a bachelor's degree, but also to try to get occupational certifications. And that's actually what she was there for. What she was primarily interested in as she was growing up was animals. She was really into animals, and the love of her life was her horse. That was not unusual in the small rural Wisconsin town that she grew up in. The main occupation, though, of people in the town was working at the paper mill. The year that Chloe graduated from high school, that paper mill closed. And the year just before she graduated from high school, her parents got divorced. When I was sitting with her in the fall of 2008, those were the things that were fresh in her mind, and the question that I asked her was, why are you here? You know, not why did you choose this particular college? Because for some people, going to college isn't actually about choosing a particular college, right? It's just about choosing some path forward in their lives. And that's what she tried to explain to me. As you can see from the quote, she said that growing up, all she knew was that you were supposed to basically get out of high school and go to college. And that the reason you would do it was not to make tons of money or to have a fancy life, but just to have a decent life. And she spent a fair bit of time trying to tell me about what decent meant to her. She had been working for quite some time. Work wasn't new to her. And she'd been working in jobs that she didn't feel were decent. Jobs where the employers weren't very nice to her. Jobs where she felt like she was underpaid. And so she was going to college to get past that life and to get a decent life where what she would become, she thought, was what's called a veterinary technical assistant. Okay, she was fairly specific in this, and what it is a job where she could take care of horses, but not be in charge of the life or death decisions. Okay, and I think that should tell you something about Chloe, right? Chloe had modest ambitions, but she knew her limitations, she knew where she wanted to be in the world, and college for her was just fitting in to fulfill this one specific role. And she didn't see a way forward without college. We found many people like her. We also met many people like Nima, another student at the same college that Chloe attended. And when I met Nima and asked her why she was at that college on that particular day that we were meeting, she told me a story about her childhood and how the best day of her life was the day that her family won the immigration lottery in Nepal, and she was given permission to come to this country. Now, she said that her purpose in going to college was really not about her. Her purpose was in being able to do better for her family, not only the family that she came with to this country, which included several brothers and grandparents and her parents, but to be able to send money back home to Nepal to support those that she'd left behind. Those individuals are two people that we met in Wisconsin, and they represent and they do stand for a lot more people. The reason that I start by talking about why they're in college is because part of the story today about these statistics, like those I'm going to discuss next, these national statistics, and the ways in which people pay for college, they are grounded in those stories, right? How we do what we do while we go through college all starts with why we're there in the first place. And a lot of people are ending up in college these days. So these numbers in front of you, these are national figures. These are not limited to Wisconsin. And this first one, if it doesn't take you by surprise, it should. Because in many ways, it's a public policy triumph. Okay, it used to be, if you go back to the 1960s or even the 70s, that if you grew up in a family with very few economic resources, frankly, you really didn't see much in front of you beyond finishing high school. You were lucky if you did that. And knowing that even then college cost something meant that your chances of doing anything more were very, very limited. We created the federal financial aid system, whose origins began in 1965, with the idea that we should let people know that college ought to be in their future and that they should believe us when we say it'll be possible because we'll offset that low income with financial aid. Clearly, some folks have received the message. Okay, such that 3 in 4 ninth graders today who grow up in low-income families not only hope to attend college, but they expect to attend college. And the sociologists in the room can explain the difference between those two things. However, of course, even at an age when our high school graduation rates are higher than ever on average, many people will nonetheless not make it through high school. But if they do, a lot of our rhetoric, especially our policy rhetoric, has told us they'll go to college. It's not true. We still have a college access problem in this country in 2017. And seeing that 1 in 2 of those students who graduates from high school, having grown up in a low-income family, and they want to go to college, 1 in 2 still won't do so. And when I say college, they don't have to show up at a place like Florida State, where you've got a 4-year degree and there's a lot involved in going to school. I'm telling you, they don't go anywhere. They don't go to any kind of institution that grants any kind of post-secondary credential, whether it's an online school or a for-profit school or a community college or a place like Harvard. They don't end up anywhere, despite wanting to go. But perhaps even more concerning is the fact that the vast majority of those low-income folks who enroll in college will not complete anything over the next 6 years. Okay, so we've got a 60% dropout rate for those folks. And there, again, I'm not saying that they have to finish a bachelor's degree to be included in the positive column. This means they don't complete a certificate, an associate degree, or a bachelor's degree. Now, once upon a time, frankly, that was a problem. It's actually not the case that degree completion rates have changed all that much over time. We might have looked at those so-called dropout rates in the past and kind of shrugged. Because we all know people who show up in college and figure out that I don't want any more of this, right? I've been sitting in a classroom for how many years, and I've just had enough, right? And even back in 1983, Charles Mansky wrote a book, this economist, he wrote a book where he framed college as the great experiment. You know, it was an experimental time when you would figure out whether or not it would suit you. You'd figure out your choices and your preferences. And if it didn't work for you, well, dropping out, that might make some sense. Dropping out no longer makes much sense. Because if you leave without anything, 9 times out of 10, you have a parting gift, and that's debt. And that changes the entire equation. Okay? Going to college and dropping out can now leave you worse off than not having gone to college at all. So the question is, how did we get here? And how is it possible that we can have those sorts of numbers when we spend money like this, $200 billion a year? I used to have trouble going beyond millions, I have to admit. As a grad student, I would hear these billions and I would think, come on, Like, I haven't even seen thousands yet, right? And so I know that if I had been sitting there going, oh, well, $200 billion a year, yeah, maybe it needs to be more. What's the military spending? What are we spending on other things? Is it a lot? You know what? $200 billion is a lot of money. There's really no way to diminish that expenditure. It's enormous. So we have to honestly ask ourselves the questions, regardless of our political persuasions. What's going on? How can we spend that kind of money and yet have so many people from low-income families dropping out? So there's like a bunch of competing explanations, as we like to talk about them in academia, right? Some people will say, all right, so we're spending all this money and we fund all this financial aid, and yet people are dropping out of college. Well, that must tell us, frankly, that why they're dropping out has very little to do with money, right? Maybe it's about, name your favorite topic, the failure of our K-12 schools, right? College remediation rates, the inability to feel like you fit in or know how to go to college, right? You just don't have the information, you don't have friends, you don't feel like you belong, right? Maybe we should be going in that direction, and those of us, including some of us in the room who spend our time studying financial aid, maybe we just need to look elsewhere to understand those college dropout rates. That's one possibility. Another camp, and it's a related camp, would say, you know what, we need to stop talking about policy problems here, and we should really be talking about problems with individuals. Because some people these days, they just don't work very hard, right? There was a book that came out a couple of years ago called Academically Adrift. How many of you are familiar with Academically Adrift? Okay, this was one of the most popular books ever written in higher education, and it became famous not only because they wrote about it in the New York Times, but because Doonesbury even made an entire cartoon about it. And what it basically said was, those kids today, you know, they just don't study like they used to, right? Rates of studying are down, and what's going on is that the faculty are really not challenging them, and they don't really want to be challenged, so they're kind of in this compact together, right, where they're not learning very much, because learning really isn't at the center of American higher education anymore. And this really captured the imagination of a lot of people, including the faculty who really would like to talk more about learning. It also captured the imagination of conservatives who thought, you know, let's go this direction, right? Because we could really move away from talking about, for example, increases to the Pell Grant and things that would cost a lot of money. Okay, so all of those things are possible, right? I mean, we have to admit, we don't really know how to discern between those various explanations for how it's possible for us to spend this much money and seem to get so little from it. And I share and have shared for a long time interest in that question. But addressing that question, how is it possible that we put money into a system and a policy and we send money out into the world and it doesn't seem to produce the effects that we would like? It's not an easy question to answer. It's a very difficult question to answer. One of the reasons is that a lot of those folks who were leaving college without a degree in hand had other life experiences, right, that might have led them to leave college whether or not they got financial aid. So I had a really uncommon opportunity that was created by the origination of a new foundation in Wisconsin. It was a private foundation. It's called the Fund for Wisconsin Scholars. And it was created when a set of very wealthy folks, people who can talk in millions, maybe even billions, they got together at Christmas one year and they said, you know, we really have a problem in Wisconsin, which is where they were from. They said a lot of people are dropping out of college. Can't afford to be there. We feel really bad about it. So what we're going to do is we're going to create a new foundation, and we're going to endow it with $175 million, okay? And we're going to start passing out money through a scholarship program to help people finish their degrees. It's pretty amazing, right? And they didn't say, and you have to get a B average in high school to do it, right? They didn't follow the models of many state programs out there that said you have to do special things and perform in order to get it. They just said you have to show up in college. You have to register full-time, which is a bit of a feat, admittedly. You should have graduated from Wisconsin Public High School. That's what they wanted to prioritize. And you do have to do something that I think is pretty special and that we don't recognize enough, which is that you do have to fill out the FAFSA. Now, how many of you have experience with the FAFSA? Hopefully prior to this year when it broke into pieces, as usual. It's a small American bureaucratic tragedy. It gets a lot of attention, but not enough attention. If you don't know, the data retrieval tool inside that thing just cracked apart, or was taken down by a government entity at precisely the moment at which so many people need to fill out their FAFSA to get money for next year. So these folks actually did it, and they did it correctly, which meant they got through the process of verification, and they learned that they got a federal Pell Grant. And a federal Pell Grant means that they are among the folks with the lowest incomes of all of today's undergraduates. When they got that award, the Pell Grant, they became eligible to get additional money from these generous people. And instead of trying to pick winners or discern who deserved the money the most, this couple decided to use a lottery, something you all are very familiar with here in Florida. Okay, some states look at me like, we never do lotteries in education, but you all do lotteries. So this isn't a new concept, but in financial aid, it's kind of unusual. And what that meant was that some people got this stroke of luck. They got a letter in the mail that said, hey, if you're at a 4-year university, you'll get another $1,800 a year. As long as you stay in school, you can get it for up to 5 years. And if you're at a 2-year college, you can get another $1,800 a year for up to 5 years. So it's a pretty good deal. Don't worry, nobody got a letter that says, bad luck, you didn't get a scholarship. Okay, they just didn't get a letter. They didn't even know it existed. The program had never existed before. The other thing that happened to those folks, and there were 3,000 of them, 1,200 of whom got extra financial aid and 1,800 of whom got their regular financial aid and nothing special, that the 3,000 of them also became part of our study. And we created a study around this program so that we could not only compare the outcomes of people getting more and less financial aid, but so that we could figure out the context into which the financial aid was landing in the first place. In other words, what this was really a study of was the lives of low-income students and their families as they tried to go to college, and where financial aid fit into their lives. We didn't actually set out or presume that it would fit in. So we didn't just ask for financial aid records. Okay? We also looked up and down at their whole college transcripts. We were able to see what kind of credits they took and the courses they took and the grades they got. But we also signed them up to become part of surveys that went on year after year after year, repeatedly, long surveys with like 100 questions in each one, on paper, not even online. And 75% of them took the surveys. Because we did we did 3 things, actually, that we know that students like. The first was we included money. We paid them. It's always a good idea. The second thing is that we asked questions that matter. And we invited them through a letter to make a difference in financial aid by teaching us about their lives. We did not say, show us what's wrong with the system. We did not say, we know it's broken, make it better. We said, teach us. And so in these surveys, we went way beyond the standard questions, like what's the difference between a grant and a loan? What's the difference between a subsidized and an unsubsidized loan? We asked all those questions, but we also asked them about things like, how many brothers and sisters do you have, and how much time do you spend taking care of them? Okay? How many times a year do you have to send money home to your family of at least $50 a month? Not only do you work, but when do you work? What hours of the day do you work, and how many jobs do you hold? And what kinds of jobs are they, and how well do they pay, and do they align at all with what you're trying to do? To go back to this concept of a decent job. We also took the time to not only assess things like, did you do good math and science classes in high school to get ready for college, but also, are you actually ready to learn? Like, how much do you sleep? What time do you go to bed at night? Do you stay asleep all night, or do you get woken up a lot? Do you have a safe, secure place to live? Do you eat every day? Okay? We asked these questions that had, to my knowledge, rarely been asked in studies of, quote, financial aid, so that we could better understand the lives of these 3,000 people. And then we did one other thing. When we sent them the surveys, we also said, would you do us a favor and sit down with us in person? Now, these folks were scattered all over the state of Wisconsin. And while you're also living in a very large state, you have a different set of issues. We faced a very particular concern with meeting people from all over the state, and it's a 4-letter word called snow. It's a very serious word. Okay, when the snow happens, travel becomes very difficult. And so we took all those people. It turned out to be over 1,000 people said that they would do interviews with us. And we took the people in southeastern Wisconsin, which is the closest to where I was working. Meant that we could drive, we wouldn't have to sit in snow traffic for more than 2.5 hours each way. And we drew a random subsample of 50 of those students from southeastern Wisconsin. And we sat down with them once or twice a year for the next 6 years. And when I say we, it was myself for some of the students, and it was some of my graduate students for other students. And what they did when they went to meet with somebody was arrange to meet them at a coffee shop or any other public place that the person was comfortable in, and sit down in front of them and ask one question: how's it going? Only in that very first interview did we ask, why are you here? We just asked, how's it going? We didn't say, how are you liking your financial aid? How's that grant working for you? You get that new special grant? Did you like it? I'm so glad that we didn't ask them such leading questions or push them in any which direction, because it meant that they were honest with us. And to give you a sample of what honesty looks like, it's when a student looks at you and says, I got this weird thing in the mail the other day. It says I'm getting extra money for college, but I don't think it's real. I think it's a scam. Imagine being the research team that has to go back and tell the program they think it's a scam. Okay? They also took us on many other pathways. They lead you down all kinds of roads that help you understand their lives better than we as researchers would have ever known to ask about. So a lot of what I'm going to talk about, I've learned from those interviews. Okay, so let me tell you a little bit about what we learned. And some of this, especially to students in the room, is probably going to sound like common sense. I got to tell you, when I told my grandmother back in 20 plus years ago that I was going to be a sociologist, she asked me why. She said, because sociology is the statement of the obvious. It is. It's actually a lot of what we do is we study the obvious and we write it down so that people who don't get what's obvious can learn about real life. So some of this should really sound like real life. The first thing is it just doesn't pay like it used to. Okay? And once upon a time, financial aid did pay reasonably well. So that Pell Grant program, which was created by a senator from Rhode Island, Claiborne Pell, it was supposed to do something pretty cool. It was supposed to say to a low-income family, guess what? You need money? We have a Pell Grant. It'll cover 100% of the cost of attending a public 2-year or 4-year school, and you will not have to take loans. In fact, loans were really not a thing for most people going to college then. And the reason we didn't want people from low-income families to take loans was, frankly, it was risky. Right? When you're coming from very few means to begin with, and you're trying to go to college partly to get ahead, it's kind of risky to borrow to do that. You can argue it's a good investment. That doesn't mean it's not without risk. All right, so let's look at some wonky numbers here. I want to first focus your attention on the blue and orange lines, which are arguably the two most important things here. All right, so the blue line is the line that you look at if you worry about money. It's how much money we spend on the Pell Grant program. And rather than take it all the way back to the 70s, these are in inflation-adjusted numbers, we just take it back to the 90s here for you, and you can see a lot of growth real fast right over here. Okay, now all of you were alive at that time, and you're probably nodding, knowing what happened. The economy went south, and more people qualified for the Pell Grant, so the orange line tracks the blue line, which means more people got the Pell Grant. That's exactly what the program was supposed to do. It's called an entitlement. It doesn't mean people feel entitled to it. It just means if you qualify, you get it. And frankly, there are very few such programs these days, right? Housing, subsidized housing, is not an entitlement. Lots and lots of people qualify for support for their housing and can't get it because there isn't enough available. Okay, so this program did exactly what it was supposed to do, but unfortunately, it ignited flames in Washington. Because when that program started to cost more money, people started to ask questions. Like, what are those people doing with that money? Seems like they're dropping out of college. Why is that? Are they wasting the money? All of a sudden, we started to hear about a new character in higher education called the Pell Runner. In case you haven't heard of the Pell Runner, you might have heard of something else. It's called the Welfare Queen. Anybody heard of the Welfare Queen? Okay, Ronald Reagan, for those of you that remember, you should know about Ronald Reagan. Ronald Reagan spent a long time sending people all over this country looking for the welfare queen. The welfare queen was a woman who was raising a bunch of kids while getting cash assistance and who rode around in a limousine enjoying her public benefits. She was a mythical figure, says social science. We couldn't find her. There's a reason. People can't make ends meet, let alone ride in limos on cash assistance, then or now. And the Pell Runner, it appears, is largely a mythical figure as well. This person supposedly showed up to get the Pell Grant, costing the government a lot of money, after filing the FAFSA, which is, such an easy way to get cash, and then running away with the money. All right? So what you got to understand is that those spikes are a problem. Not a problem because the program isn't working, but a problem because they freak people out. Now, it would have been one thing if during that time the program was actually transferring more and more money to students all over this country, except it wasn't. Those are the flat lines at the bottom. That's what it was transferring to students. That's the average and maximum Pell during that time. And again, that amount would have been okay if only the price of college wasn't going up during that period. I didn't even draw that line on there for you because I know you can already see it in your head, right? It is a line that goes up and up and up, and what happens as that happens is that the value of that grant that's flatlined goes down and down and down. Okay, now I saw this chart in grad school. This is not a new chart. It has more years on it, but I was always told the purchasing power of the Pell Grant has declined, and thought, okay, what's that mean? Well, what that means is that the coupon, right, the 100% off, it's not 100% off anymore. It's actually not even 100% off if you go to community college, okay? It's about 40% off, maybe 60% off. It's 60% off if you go to community college. It's about 30% off if you go to a public university. And goodness, if you take it to a private institution, you're going to get about 13% off, okay? Now, again, it would be one thing if we told people that, except we don't. Students find this out. They find out about the slope of those lines after they've decided they want to go to college, and often after they've already registered and shown up for classes. It's kind of like being in the middle of your meal, enjoying dinner, halfway done, right? And then being told you owe $500 for whatever you just ate. Except you didn't think it was going to cost you anything, and you don't have any money. Think about that situation. You can't give it back. There's nothing to give back, right? You already learned the stuff. There's nothing to return. So now you're all in. You're into college. You want to stay, but you don't have the money to stay. That means that not only are those lines confusing to people, that would be a nice way to put it, but as these students explain to us, it actually just makes them angry. This feels like betrayal. This feels like a promise was told to us. We were told the FAFSA, all you have to do is FAFSA, things will be okay, and then you find out this. All right, so let's walk through what this looks like in real life, and here I'm going to turn to a guy named Ian Williams. Ian Williams grew up in the city of Milwaukee. Milwaukee, Wisconsin is the most hyper-segregated city in the entire country. It is also one of the most impoverished. It is also home to one of the largest black-white gaps in achievement in the Milwaukee public schools. It is a triumph to make it out of the Milwaukee public schools, especially if you're an African-American man like Ian Williams. He grew up in a home with 3 other siblings and a single mom. When he went to college, he filled out his FAFSA. He had 4 siblings and a single mom. They make less than $25,000 a year. Ian Williams should be the poster child for the Pell Grant program. His expected family contribution, which is what you get, this little present you get after you fill out the FAFSA, you get this EFC, and it tells you what your family is expected to be able to pay. Well, they figured he could come up with $425. That was his modest contribution. Okay? Of the things that we saw, that wasn't one of the worst, I got to tell you. And you know what? His mom actually did come up with those funds. The problem was this. Ian went to his nearby public university, which is what most people do. Most people don't open up U.S. News and pick the highest ranked school to go to. They go to the one closest to them. This was on the bus route from his home. The price in 2008 at that public university was over $17,000 a year. That's tuition fees books and supplies, medical, transportation, personal expenses, and those two essentials, housing and food. That was the off-campus price. And he got grants. His grants amounted to just over $7,000 a year. That includes a partial Pell Grant, almost at the maximum, and a Wisconsin grant that mirrors the Pell Grant except for one thing. You don't know if you're going to get it. It's not an entitlement. Like so many state grants, the more people who apply for the Wisconsin grant, the more people are simply placed on the waiting list. So in his first year, he got the Wisconsin grant to complement his Pell Grant. In his second year, he applied the same day he did the prior year, but the fund was already out of money. So if you look at that math, you should be kind of shaking your head, because the Pell Grant program was supposed to work such that he would owe $17,633 minus $425. That's the amount the Pell Grant should have covered. And not only didn't, but even with the state grant included, it didn't. How is he supposed to come up with another $10,000 in a family that makes $25,000? That was the question that Ian Williams was facing at age 19 years old. Okay? Is it any wonder that he turned and looked at those federal loans? He did, and he took them. And lots of students we saw didn't. Okay? I'll show you those figures later. But even after taking them, he still had a balance, because the federal loan maximum is just $5,500 a year for a first-year student. You know, we spend a lot of time talking about how too many people are taking loans and how big those loans are. We actually don't talk about the fact that when you really need it, that's actually a really small amount relative to the prices. So what was he supposed to do? Well, some people would say, well, that's what the Parent Plus loan was created for. It was for his family to take on, for his mom to take on, in order to make up the difference. But anybody who says that is overlooking a very common fact, which is that a lot of people can't meet the credit check to obtain the Parent Plus loan, even if they're willing to do such a risky thing and take that loan. And his mom was one of those people. To make matters worse, Ian Williams was soon to find out, just like Chloe Johnson and Nima and everybody else in our study, that those prices I just showed you, those numbers, they're fake. There's really no nice way to say it. They're fake numbers, okay? These statistics lie, and they lie for reasons that are actually baked into the system itself, okay? They're long-standing errors. One error is that the expected family contribution is based on a needs analysis that neglects debt. A lot of people are going to face this soon when they have their own student debt to repay and they go to send their kids to college, and they find out it doesn't actually matter that you have student debt of your own. Okay? Debt is neglected, so your ability to pay is often overstated. But actually, things get worse. Because on the very low end, for the people who have what's called the zero expected family contribution, which put in plain English means you don't have any money to pay for college, and we know it, right? The zero is actually also a fake number. Because for families like Ian, that before he went to college, he was contributing to his mom's income during high school by giving her some of that money. When he goes to college, that money is no longer going to be there. When you run that needs analysis, you get a negative number. Okay? Now, what that would mean is that not only should we not charge him for college, but we should actually give his family money if we want to make up for their real need. We should transfer money to the family. Except that does not align with the principles of financial aid in this country. We don't transfer money to families. So instead, we just change the negative number to a zero. Now, we computed using the raw data that goes into the FAFSA, people's actual expected family contributions, and found negatives frequently. These negatives could even reach up to negative $10,000. So imagine what happens to a student who is told, let's say, your institution costs $20,000 a year, and you're a zero EFC student. So you should get $20,000 in grant aid. And let's say they were super lucky, and because of Florida's generosity and FSU's generosity, they had $20,000 in grant aid. Quote, their need is met. Okay? Great situation to be in. But that student one day comes up short when it comes to paying for rent and goes into the financial aid office and says, I'm short. I need money. The reality is they do. The EFC is negative $10,000, which means their real need is not 20, it's 30. Because probably, just like they did in high school, they are contributing money to their families. The response from that aid officer, who is also just trying to do her job and follow federal law, is probably going to be, you need to learn to live within your means. We have a financial education program we can refer you to. This is going to contribute to the anger and sense of betrayal the student feels, and they probably don't know why, because they don't know that the number they were given was inaccurate. The other reason the number is often inaccurate is because the cost of attendance is also largely a fake number. It is made up not only of tuition and fees, which a college determines, but a whole set of other numbers which the college does not determine, the most important of which is the cost of living off campus. Okay, so for 87% of today's undergraduates, they do not live on campus. So they do not live in housing set by the institution. Yet the institution lists and limits financial aid according to the cost of living off campus, a number they have to guess at. Institutions are allowed to do a whole array of things to determine what it costs to live off campus. They can read the local newspapers and look at ads. They can call friends who are landlords and assess what people are charging. They could survey students and find out what they're spending. Almost anything is allowed as long as they say what it is. Our research has revealed that 1/3 of public colleges and universities in this country are understating the real cost of living by at least $3,000. And it's not just happening at public schools. We've been able to watch as for-profit institutions, as they become under scrutiny for their prices, just keep dropping what it apparently costs to live while you're going to school. They're facing strong incentives to do so, because lowering tuition means bringing in less money to the institution. But if you lower the cost of living, you can look more affordable. I was recently invited up to the New School, a private institution in New York that I think highly of. And when I was on the train, I all of a sudden realized I hadn't been invited by the administration. I'd been invited by the students. And I thought, maybe let me go look at their data. And would you know that according to the data and according to the New School, it's become less expensive to live in New York City over the last 5 years? Okay. You know, I don't know who at the school knew they were doing that, and it may not have been intentional. But the point is, they face incentives to do that. They're being pushed towards doing that. And yet we just look at prices that a college lists on their website for living not on their campus, and we make decisions based on them. Of course, the other issue is this one, which is what people found if they went to the state's flagship in our study. The cost of going to school with people who have a lot more money than you do is high. And we can try to minimize it. We can tell people, well, when I went to college, I wore old clothes, I shopped in consignment shops, whatever. But the cost of keeping up is real. Sometimes it's that you're just doing a group project with other people and you got to be able to have an iPhone so you can get in touch with other folks or text with them. Okay? We're regularly watching students fall short of the things they need simply to be in groups with other students. And these problems, I'm guessing, are worse at our very elite institutions, which are claiming to work very hard right now to recruit those very students to their campuses. I haven't studied them yet. All right, so let's look at what was actually happening to these students and how they were making ends meet during that first year of college. We split it out by the students at the community and technical colleges and those at the four-year universities. These are all Pell recipients, right? The vast majority of those at the four-year schools were already taking loans during their first year, and a substantial number of those at two-year schools were as well. Although I have to tell you that those schools were more populated by students who definitely would not be taking a loan under any circumstances. They did not view it as the right way to attend college, and they very much understood the risk. What you can also see is that we have a preponderance of students who are working during school. But I want to highlight two things, because I think we all know that students work these days. What I want you to focus on is how many of them work but do not have work study. Okay, now that's a program that has a 99% customer satisfaction rate. How many programs can you say that with, right? The General Accountability Office, Government Accountability Office, as it's now called, has studied this program, and they have found that people really like working on campus, right? Compared to alternatives, it's decent. It doesn't always pay as well, but it saves you money and time on commuting. Yet very few students have work-study funding among all these Pell recipients. You have to ask yourself, how can that be? Well, there are two answers. First, the program is incredibly underfunded. As more people have qualified for it over time, it is not an entitlement, and the funding has stagnated, so people are turned down. The second problem is that the distribution of work-study funds follows a formula across campuses in this country that has nothing to do with how many people on campus need work-study money. It has nothing to do with virtually anything that should matter in American higher education in 2017. What it has to do with is the age of the institution. The funding for the work-study program, like most campus-based aid, flows towards Plymouth Rock. Okay? So in one of the chapters of my book, I illustrate the differences in work-study allocations at Marquette University, an old private institution in Milwaukee, and the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee, which is where most people go to college in Milwaukee. And you'll see that their budgets are very similar, despite the fact that Marquette has a fraction of the students and far fewer students with need. The other thing you can see, though, and I've had several audiences raise this, is not everybody is working. And some folks, if I split this out by race ethnicity, would notice something else. We should assume that our African American and Latino students have greater financial need, as they do throughout the country. Their family has less wealth to begin with. Yet their rates of work are not as high as the non-Hispanic white students. Now, you could look at that evidence and you could think several things, right? One is maybe they don't have as much time. Maybe they're helping take care of siblings, things like that. But that's not it, okay? We explored this. We wondered, well, maybe some people, as some people have asserted, just don't want to work as much. I didn't think much of that explanation because it wasn't borne out by any level of the data. The effort exhibited and the interest in work exhibited was very substantial, regardless of race ethnicity. What we instead found was this. Vast majority of people not working, they're trying to work. We don't ask this of college students. We ask this of the general public. The Bureau of Labor Statistics, when assessing how many people are in today's workforce, does not just ask if you're working. They ask if you're seeking work. And the reason is that seeking work is work. It's just work that doesn't pay. It's just work that's demeaning and frustrating and time-consuming. But what we saw overwhelmingly were that the racial disparities, the apparent racial disparities in employment of the students in the study had nothing to do with a difference in effort, and everything to do with the fact that most of our African American and Latino students lived in Milwaukee, where the unemployment rate was especially high, yet job search was exceedingly common. Finally, what the students really taught us was how hard it is to find help these days. You are more likely than ever to fall short of finances in college. Okay, now, I worked my way through college. I worked 40 hours a week, and I took 18 credits a term because I understood that that's how it was going to go. And I was lucky that my employer gave me as many hours as I wanted waiting tables. And I was also lucky that we didn't used to report tips on credit cards. Still, I fell short from time to time. My family wasn't terribly bad off, it just the money wasn't coming to me. So I would call my grandfather. I'd say, Papa, I need a couple $100. And I'd get a little lecture. I'd get a lot of Jewish guilt. And then I'd take the check, go do what I needed to do. You're so lucky if you have a grandfather like mine. You're so lucky. But a lot of people have great-grandfathers, and they just don't have a couple $100 to share. So what happens to these students? I remember the first time one of my graduate students came back to me from an interview crying. She said, "You didn't prepare me." Professors in the room, I can only imagine that you get what that must feel like. Because I had done all the training that I was supposed to do to get them ready. We did the consent forms and the tape recorders, and we went over the starting question. What had I not prepared her for? What I had not prepared her for was when an 18-year-old woman enrolled at a public university looked her in the eye and said, "No, I am not okay." And she said, "Why?" And the woman responded, "Because I haven't eaten in 2 days." We were not asking about food on that first survey or housing because we didn't know to. Nobody told us that we needed to. The students told us that we needed to. So then we started asking. And in the fall of 2009, we found that 24% of our students, according to USDA standardized measures, were food insecure. We still weren't even using the instrument right. So I can't go beyond that number. But that number's correct. It's just that I can't go deeper than that to tell you just how many of them were deeply food insecure. We also didn't measure housing insecurity in a detailed way at that time, but we found that 16% of them had trouble paying rent on time. Now, since that moment when she came back and told me I didn't prepare her, I decided we would be ready from then on. So we have become experts at the Wisconsin Hope Lab in college hunger and homelessness. And 2 weeks ago, we issued our latest report in Washington, D.C. We didn't do it in Madison, and we didn't do it in Philly, where I live now, because that's not where the real policymakers live. They live in D.C., and we wanted to come as close to them as we possibly could and stand up in front of them and let them know that we had just completed the largest study ever conducted to date on this topic. 33,000 community college students at 70 colleges in 24 states answered our latest survey. Survey response rate was abysmally low. It was only 4.5%. But we didn't have any money to conduct that study. We did it on a shoestring because it's not a technological intervention and foundations don't throw money at you to study these sorts of things right now. Nevertheless, I tend to think that the numbers we found were underestimates. That's because students who are hungry and homeless, they do not exactly jump at the chance to answer surveys, especially those that have no money attached to them. Nonetheless, we found that 2 in 3 of those 33,000 people are food insecure, and 1 in 3 are food insecure to the point at the very lowest levels that it is associated with hunger. Moreover, 50% of the 33,000 people are housing insecure, which means they have trouble with things like utilities or rent, and 14% of them are homeless. When I say someone is homeless or I say someone is food insecure, I'm not talking about ramen, and I'm not talking about couch surfing because you just can't decide which friend to hang with. I'm talking about sleeping in your car, sleeping on the street, sleeping in an abandoned building, or if you're really lucky, sleeping in a shelter. We're still startled by these numbers. We still can't get over it, but the one thing we have decided is we have to do better than this. Because we tracked these folks, and despite what I would argue are fairly heroic efforts to try to pay these high prices of college, only half of them got anything over 6 years. But more than 2 in 5 ended up with a parting gift, which, as I described before, is called student debt. Now, none of these students had $100,000 in student loans, because that's not real. It's a problem of a very small number of people. And those people usually finished college and they got graduate degrees. And I do feel bad for them. I really do. It's a lot of money to owe. But the people who are falling apart over student debt are falling apart because they didn't get college degrees. Many of them didn't even last more than a year. People like Chloe Johnson, who tried to go to school to take care of her horse, who ended up selling that horse to cover her expected family contribution and was still short by $12,000 a year. People like Chloe, who work 2 jobs and take 18 credits a term to try to get done fast, but nonetheless fall asleep on their desks and end up with bad grades. People like Chloe don't even last a whole term. She got her loan payment, which she didn't want to take, but she decided she had to quit one of those jobs. She got her loan payment 2 days before she dropped out. 6 years later, she's still trying to repay that debt. They come away not only upset, but I also want to point out, in post-November election, I've had to point out, they do things with that anger. I think somebody needs to take a good hard look at what we think is an education divide in our electorate. Because I don't think all those folks without college degrees didn't try to get college degrees. I'm betting a bunch of them went, like these folks did, to try to go to college and face prices that represented a complete betrayal of what they were told they needed to be doing. And they're struggling under that debt, and they don't see any help forthcoming from government. So yeah, we have to do better than this. And I think that we can say that from an empirical standpoint. I'm not sure we need another study, frankly, to tell us that we have to do better than this. The question about how to do better is the really interesting and difficult one. So let me give you a few suggestions, and I'm happy to talk more in Q&A or afterwards or via Twitter or wherever else you want to get a hold of me about how we do better than this. The first thing that we do is we do better by the students by actually supporting them with the things that really, really matter for them. We spend a lot of time testing students, both in elementary school and in high school and in college. On the way in the door, we call it college readiness. We spend very little time after they turn 18 making sure that they are fed and housed. The National School Lunch Program and the National School Breakfast Program are good programs, and they work. And we have them not because of the science behind them, but because we decided as a country it was immoral not to have them. It was the faith-based community that ensured that we had those programs. My guess is if we're going to get them for higher education, it's going to be the faith-based community that helps push it forward. Because for some strange reason, we have drawn a bright line in the sand. All programs that support our basic needs as conditions for education, they all disappear the moment that somebody transitions to the 13th year of college. So the least we can do at colleges and universities is size up if students have their needs met. And even if we will do nothing else to help them, we can at least flag them in our databases. Maybe just so we're not surprised when they don't make it through the term. Better yet, to send a student or somebody else out to talk to them. Because one of the things we learn from those students is how profoundly isolating it is to experience having no place to turn at the end of the day, no place to go do your homework, no place to sleep at night. They feel a sense of shame and stigma, and they don't think there's anybody on their college campus they can tell. We could do better and equip faculty and staff the way that we're supposed to be equipping them to detect risk of suicide, to detect things like the risk of homelessness. If you teach in this university, you should ask yourself, do you know what you're looking at? When the student falls asleep in class, do you do what I did when I was an assistant professor and assume that student just didn't want to learn? I remember looking at her. I remember thinking, oh, sweetie, you are so wasting my time. I'm teaching sociology of education, and I'm a PhD, and I know what I'm doing, and you don't like me. I'll tap on your shoulder and tell you to come to my office hours. I'll sit down across from you. I'll hand you a tissue while you cry. Oh, wait. Turns out you're not lazy. Turns out you're working the graveyard shift till an hour and a half before my class starts in the morning. We don't know what we don't ask about, and we regularly don't ask. It wasn't my job to solve that for her. I was lucky I had a work-study position to offer her. I was lucky that helped her finish college, and she went on to graduate school and has a degree in educational policy, but that was luck. We need systematic solutions. We could, while we screen them for financial aid, we could also screen them for eligibility for other social benefits programs like food stamps. The food stamp program is an entitlement. The state of Florida could be drawing down a lot more money if it wanted to by helping every undergraduate and even graduate students get those benefits. It faces many barriers to doing so, but the biggest barrier is that we haven't decided that it's our job. We can address all the fake numbers, okay? There is no reason for any administrator at a university to decide what it costs to live in the area around that university because there are standardized numbers that are readily available and computed. Those are the things that, for example, drive those cost of living calculators that you use when you decide whether you can afford to move across the country. These are the things that determine what the advocates call a living wage. These numbers are already available, and they shouldn't vary from institution to institution within the same little geographic area. We can also do more to simply integrate what we do on campus with what people are doing in the communities around us. So I can guarantee you that there is a very nice community food pantry that's already operating, and there are probably soup kitchens, and there are probably people who know how to tell you which shelter is the safest to sleep in. Those people need to be here having those conversations. And when it becomes the case that the campus has enough need to merit having its own pantry, or if you're UCLA, your own homeless shelter, then you should have it. And in the meantime, we should be fundraising not only for financial aid, but for emergency aid. Financial aid is those giant grants. You have to go to big donors to ask for that kind of money. But you can go to alumni to ask for emergency aid. Last summer, when I got ready to start launching this book, I started thinking, how am I going to go out there and face all these people and tell them what's going on and face more and more homeless students? Because every single campus I go to, somebody comes up and reveals that to me. How can we keep on doing that and I have nothing to give them that's actually concrete, right? Policy ideas and programmatic suggestions. They need money. So we created, with a couple of colleagues of mine, including Tressie McMillan-Cottom and a couple of other researchers, Elizabeth Vaquera, we made something called the FAST Fund. And I took a chunk of my salary, and they gave me a little bit too, and we put it in there, and we created an emergency aid program. We picked 3 colleges around the country, and what we're doing is just giving the teachers, giving the faculty, who are mainly adjuncts, money to give out to the students. They give it out whenever they see fit. And what I like about that is there's no administrative process. You don't need to go through a FAFSA to get emergency aid. You need to do what I did when I called my grandfather. You need to say you need money. And then we need to believe them, and we need to give it out. And there are colleges and universities that have emergency aid programs, and you may very well have one here. But you don't really have one until every student knows it exists. We don't often tell students about emergency aid because we're afraid they'll ask for money. Kind of defeats the purpose. Okay? If you don't have enough, and I guarantee you won't, given these prices, and that's not your fault, when you don't, you make a waiting list. And you take the waiting list and you use it to go fundraise. You tell all the stories of all the people you needed to help and you could not help. And by the way, for evaluation purposes, you also take that waiting list and you compare their outcomes to the people who you were able to help. Those are the people who would have gotten money if only you had it. We can also just do some things to say, look, you did a lot of hard work to get to college in the first place. You already filled out the FAFSA. Let's try to avoid taking your money away from you just because you got bad grades in your first year. Lots of people screw up in their first year of college. Lots of people take too many classes at one time, or too many hard classes at one time, or choose the wrong classes. And when they try to remove themselves for those classes, or drop a course, or fall asleep during class because they're working too many jobs, they can actually manage to disqualify themselves from financial aid. It's because of something known as the Satisfactory Academic Progress Standard. And it is why there is no need-based aid in this country. It is all merit aid. You've all merited it if you got it, because you did the FAFSA in the first place. Your families are heroic, okay? And beyond that, you make SAP, and it's not easy to make SAP. The good news is that the federal government has actually given colleges and universities the right to determine their own SAP policies. It doesn't want to control your academics, and you already have the right to decide that you're not going to put first-year students through that. There's plenty of evidence to suggest that you shouldn't, because SAP doesn't make people work harder. SAP just forces them out of school. We can also just do more with our language and our messaging. We spend a lot of time on marketing to fundraise. We could spend time marketing to students in more effective ways. The language that's used on today's college campuses is highly focused on independence. What I showed you from the beginning here is that for the most vulnerable students, they are actually in very interdependent frames of thinking with their families, with their communities. It's not all about them. What they want most of all is to feel part of the community. Anything you can do to emphasize that in your letters, to let them know that you consider them part of the family even if they are struggling and you want to keep them here, that will go over better than letters that just emphasize the need to pull themselves up by their bootstraps and move forward. There is so much stigma associated, as I said before, with economic challenges. We need to actually just normalize it. It shouldn't be a bad thing for a college president to say it's expensive to go there and admit that's a problem. Because at public institutions, you're not setting your prices. While the public might believe that you are, in fact, it's a whole system of checks and balances and negotiations with legislators. It is not set by you. It's especially true at the nation's community colleges. And so why not say we're really sorry about these prices and work together with the students to try to address them? We need to do more to restore the ability of students to work their way through college. We can fix that work-study program, although I have to be honest, somebody in Washington just proposed slashing the thing. We can raise the minimum wage. We can try to convince our employers that they're not going to be able to hire our students if they don't actually treat them well enough that they can get to the degree in the first place. And we can also take a look at some examples from around the country that are showing us ways to acknowledge that students regularly work their way through college and make it part of the curriculum. So one of the bright spots of the last week, one bright spot was ACA, and the second bright spot was the day that Paul Quinn College in Dallas, Texas, a historically black college, became the 9th work college in the United States and the first in an urban area. By becoming a work college, it received additional support and a federal designation, acknowledging that those students do work in college, that that work is integrated into their curriculum and is part of their lives. That's something that more of us should look at. It's currently only happening at very small institutions like Paul Quinn and Berea. And I'm also going to advance the possibility of a radically different system, at least for discussion. Okay, now, more than 100 years ago, and I have to say I said this before the President Obama did, more than 100 years ago, we started trying to make high school free. It actually happened 100 years ago. It took 80 years before that to fight to make it happen. The reason was because we figured out that the amount of education we were then requiring wasn't going to hack it anymore for our folks. We also did something else, by the way. We lengthened childhood. We stopped sending our kids into the fields to work and into factories, and we decided that we would let them be kids. That's a good thing. I don't think too many of us want to roll that one back. So maybe it's time, after lengthening childhood and sending people to high school, to acknowledge that the 13th year of education at the very minimum is necessary now. You can't fix a car anymore without a computer. A lot of the people that I'm talking about are not pursuing bachelor's degrees in philosophy or women's studies, although those are great things. They're pursuing occupational degrees at community colleges so they can go straight to work. And they can't even do that with today's prices. One of the reasons is because there is an enormous group of people who are being left out of our college affordability approach. It's called the middle class. And it's where some of my most recent work is at. We've been spending time with people who are too rich to get the federal Pell Grant and too poor to be able to afford college. And yeah, they're unhappy too. And it looks like it's for very good reason, because we've got some new empirical evidence that would show you that if you gave them grants, they too would make more progress in college. In other words, they need the price of college to be reduced in order for them to persist at higher rates and complete their degrees. So they're not actually very fond of an approach that targets all the money to the people at the bottom. And I got to tell you, the people at the so-called bottom, they're not happy either, because their program isn't worth much anymore. Fighting to keep a program that delivers a tiny little coupon while leaving out lots of other people, right, has not appeared to be a very politically sustainable strategy. So I think it's worth having the conversation about other ways to move forward. And in the interest of time, I'm going to stop there, give you my Twitter handle and my email so that we can be in touch and take your questions. Thank you. So are people just supposed to do hands, or do we want to do mics? Any preferences? Okay, I see no preferences, so just do hands. Okay, there's one all the way in the back. Speak really loudly, please.
Yeah, I was wondering what you think of the program. I know specifically I've heard about it, where, if your family makes something like less than $200,000 a year, you can go to Vanderbilt for How are those programs working?
So one challenge is we haven't been able to study them very well. They're not that accessible to some of us. I'm really dying to know, and I'm dying to know for at least two reasons. One is that one of my favorite junior professors is a guy named Tony Jack, who's now in the Harvard Graduate School of Education. And Tony Jack spent the last several years doing an ethnography at one of those schools that makes that promise that you won't have to take any debt and that we really want low-income students to come. And Tony Jack uncovered food and housing insecurity, even in that setting. Second, as part of my travels around the country this past year, I got to go to one of those schools that the New York Times rates as the best for low-income students. In fact, it recently gotten $1 million prize for being so affordable for low-income students and having so many as a percentage of its 1,600 student body. The question that's always asked of that institution is, do you package loans for low-income students? And the answer, of course, is no, we don't. In fact, you can go up to a fairly high income, like you described, and we don't package loans. That's the wrong question. If you want to know if college is affordable for students, you ask them how many of your students from lower-income families had to take debt. And 28% of their graduates who are on the Pell Grant have debt. The question is why? One answer is because they wanted to. One answer is they can't live within their means. Another answer is there's a lot of stuff that it costs to go to college like that you're not covering. And that's a question about what we value. Can we afford to pay for a student who can't afford to send their parents to their graduation from one of those schools? Can we afford to help that family come, or should the student take a loan? If you're sitting on a $2 billion or $3 billion or $10 billion or $20 billion endowment, you can ask yourself those questions. So the challenge is that we rarely get to study up in this way as researchers and get real access to their data so that we can really find out. But we should, and we should demand it because, frankly, our taxpayer dollars are going there to help subsidize those programs for which they win awards. Yes?
So what is an actually contrast that example? You mentioned Ian and his family situation, 4 siblings, some others, the family of 24 doesn't go hand in hand. What is the poverty line? Why is that not a factor in FAFSA?
It is. It is. The poverty line, or not, the poverty line is not the factor in FAFSA. A bunch of things are a factor in FAFSA, right? So income is a factor in FAFSA. Assets are a factor in FAFSA, right? If you have a home, even if that home has very little value, it will count against you to some extent, not the way that it used to. Look, they don't want it to be the broader issue is we don't want it to be a simple formula, so to speak, because we don't want anybody to be able to game it. They actually believe that if the line was, say, the poverty line, that you would try to go under the poverty line to get financial aid for college. This is the claim. The claim I've asked repeatedly is, why don't we take debt into account? Because you might look like you can afford college, but you can't because you're swimming in debt. And this happens all the time. So take somebody who, let's say, was Pell eligible because their dad had been unemployed for 3 years. I've got a young woman in the book who went through this. Dad was unemployed for 3 years. Dad suddenly gets a job. Guess what? You have a young woman who is grinning because dad got a job and he's never been happier, and who literally 30 seconds later, I promise you, will be crying because she's about to lose the Pell Grant and everything else that she had that was tied to the Pell Grant. But dad doesn't have the money to replace her lost financial aid because he has a huge pile of debt from being unemployed for 3 years. So we seem to think in Washington that if we were to acknowledge those challenges, then people would deliberately have these challenges in order to get more financial aid. And I would say that we actually know from policy studies that there will be a few people who will do that. We call them bad apples in policy parlance. The question is, how hard do you want to work to get rid of the bad apples? Well, you might be calling a whole bunch of people ineligible for a program because you were working so hard in the orchard to find those folks. This is a program that is all about trying to avoid having too many bad apples get anything. Yes?
You mentioned the complexity of how tuition rates are determined in public institutions. Could you be more specific about how that gets handled? You mentioned the complexity of the negotiations.
Yep.
Do you have any ideas on how we could actually bring tuition costs down?
Yeah, okay. So first, in the public sector, it really genuinely is quite complicated, and I mean that because it's often devolved to the very local level, right? So almost half of our undergraduates go to community colleges, and the mix of funding for community colleges varies by state, and some percentage come from localities, and so it depends on what the locality has decided, often with the tuition rate, and it also depends on what the state says, and yes, it has some role for the institution to say what they need. But I think one of the biggest problems we actually have is institutions don't know what they need. So we don't have a parallel in higher education to what we have in K-12 education, where we have estimates of what it costs to educate people, right? So if we took a student who didn't do great in high school and is now at the post-secondary level, and we need to get them a certificate in veterinary technical assistantship, what should that cost? What are the ingredients that go into that, right? We actually don't know. And if you asked an institution, what do you spend creating a person getting a bachelor's degree, they're often not going to know. I've asked these questions all over the place, right? I asked UW-Madison because I worked there and I wanted to bring the prices down. What does it cost? And how does that compare to your state appropriation? And how do you know you have to make up for it with tuition? All they can show me is what they get to bring in. And they can show me broad budget categories of spending. But that won't bake a cake, right? And it won't create a single student's budget. And that's what we actually do need. And it should be possible to compute, at least at the most basic program levels, for things that are common in different places, right? So there is a real informational problem. And my team has been trying to work on this with community colleges. It, again, seems that there are more people who want to create apps than fund research to go into the budgets like that, right? It's because we actually have to go and ask a whole series of questions of everybody involved in that education in order to dissect it. But it would enable us to have a conversation about whether Oregon can really get away with spending less than $5,000 per student at the community college level, and why we should be giving taxpayer dollars to Amherst, which says on its website it spends $100,000 per student per year. Okay, maybe we're creating mini Einsteins there. Maybe, and maybe we should. Or maybe they were already really well educated and we're not adding all that much value with our $100,000 per student per year. I don't know, right? But there's an enormous variation out there in what we spend, and we can't do the right leveling of it. Yeah. Yes? I haven't studied mentoring programs. I also haven't studied anything involving private business doing any sort of matching. I do think that we know from the history of educational policy in this country that private business is going to play any real role in reform or change of any kind. I think that all we're at with private business is a discussion about whether we're producing the right kinds of people right now. Right? And I think the good part of that discussion is we should be talking about what students do in college. Right? We should be talking about the core competencies they gain. We shouldn't be doing what we are doing, which is saying, look, we got too many people going into the wrong careers here, and they're not going to be able to repay their loans. I object to using the price of college to determine what people ought to be able to do. In other words, the problem is that the loans are needed in the first place. And if what we're going to do is send a bunch of 18-year-olds into careers starting at age 18 because we're afraid that they won't be able to repay their debt, I think we're going to have a lot more career changing later on, right? I mean, there's a sense at which, again, people don't know what they want to be when they quote unquote grow up, and that's why we've had college for so long. And if we're going to make them determine that at age 18, I'm very worried about those consequences. I think we're going to go into a very tracked system. But I would like to see more private business stepping up and talking about the role that they can play in filling some of these needs, especially in times like this, where it's pretty clear federal investment's going to go down. And I would see no reason to think that graduation rates should even continue to be where they are. I would expect our dropout rates, in other words, to rise as federal investment pulls back. And private business could play a role in trying to make sure that doesn't happen. Yes.
So we know that in some spots, that, especially in elite institutions, that their care program is here, but like their resources for the minority and lower income students is wildly effective.
Mm-hmm.
And we're trying to, I guess, mirror that in lower elite colleges. Do you see a way that can happen without, they have obviously more resources.
Right.
For their minority and low income students. Do you see, is there a plausible way to convince those people on these bills that this can be done to throw more money into these systems? And there's a caveat to that because I study race within higher education, and a lot of people throw the fact that minorities at attend elite, who attend elite colleges graduate at a higher rate than whites. However, graduation rates of minorities is actually declining.
Yes, it is.
So there's more whites going, but less minorities going and at a higher rate. So they're convoluting the actual message.
They're totally convoluting it, and they're not talking about access in the first place, right?
How do we get that to those people who probably went to these elite schools and judges anyway?
Yeah. Okay. So you're actually asking, in my view, about the political economy of higher ed policy, right? Which is a big old thing. Because, you know, one of the things that kills me about all this discussion about getting more people into these elite schools, because you name it, vulnerable group graduates at higher rates, right, is that we don't actually know what's causing that. And there's a whole lot of what I would call creaming on the way in, right? There's a whole lot of selection. And the biggest challenge they face, right, in demonstrating to us that what they do works is that they do so much choosing on the front end, and that they keep the gates so tightly shut so that they're almost always talking about very small programs, right? The real challenge for anything we're going to do in higher ed, really, is going to be scale. So to me, I want to know what works at a place like this. I want to know what works at a place like Georgia State, right? Did you see that they closed the black-white gap at Georgia State? The thing is closed. Like, it's not there. Okay? I'm interested in that. Now, the only thing I'll say to Georgia State is show us your numbers, because they haven't yet, right? They showed us the outcomes. They did not show us, right, the evaluation that gets you to those numbers. I'm interested in whatever's happening at Arizona State, right? Now, but the political economy part is, how do you convince people who have a vested interest in making sure that the success of the kind of programs you're talking about, they don't want them to happen, right? Because every time, and this is where I'm going to just be a sociologist for a minute, every time that we decrease inequality, we find another way to maximize it. So, I mean, there is a dynamic to all of this, and I try to lay this out in the book. It mirrors the same sorts of things, as I said in the beginning, that went on with welfare reform, right? Just as people get a leg up, we tell them, "Nuh-uh, this is not for you." And we do that by withholding funding. So this is where, I gotta say, if you don't like the system, the number one part of the system that has to change is how we vote. And the fact that we do vote at all. You know, I've been saying this to middle-class families all over the country. They keep thinking that they're going to find the magical 529 that's going to make college affordable. You can no longer save your way out of this, right? You can't whine your way out of this. You can't complain your way out of this. You can protest your way out of this, but it has to include voting. Because I just don't know that we have a receptive audience to change those things. And the one slam that I will take, and I don't like this slam, but I'm going to acknowledge this slam, is that some of the programs that a lot of us think are probably very effective, programs like Upward Bound and TRIO and those sorts of programs, for a variety of reasons, are not going to be subjected to the kind of evaluation that is used to drive funding decisions, right? And some of those reasons are good and some of those reasons are not good, but they cast those programs as suspect, right? And there's a lot of so-called liberals in Washington right now that are saying we're not going to support those programs unless they have a randomized controlled trial around them. And we know there's good reasons not to put that around them. We also know that they're not going to get ahead without that. And even if they do have that, they're probably not getting ahead, right? So it's a broader challenge. But if you could get 75% of Americans voting, I think that would be a good start. Yeah. I think there's a place for hybrid learning, and there is a place for open educational resources. I'm not sure there's a place for MOOCs, because MOOCs are basically effective for people who already have college. And it doesn't surprise me that we got excited about it, because we get excited about technology. It's like this thing that we do. We just do. And it leads us astray, right? Because what seems to work is the stuff that we've always done. People and other people being together. And some hybrid will work because people have complicated schedules and complicated lives, and absolutely we should accommodate that. But the outcomes of online only don't look good for the people who need higher completion rates, right? And just today, actually, in Inside Higher Ed, there's a pretty powerful person arguing that we shouldn't have open educational resources. God forbid we make the textbooks affordable, right? I mean, you can see who's making what off of this system. So I like that push. I would be wary, though, of faculty being told what to teach because the textbooks need to be free. I think that would be the wrong way to go about it. So I like the movement that, like, the Hewlett Foundation in California is doing, where they're saying to colleges, especially community colleges, let's engage those faculty, let them create the curriculum around a set of materials that are available, and let's see if they come up with some things they do like. Because if you could tell a student that there will be no supplies of books required for the class, then you could knock $1,000 off their bill, right? And maybe they'll eat. And I mean, I think that's the kind of stuff that we need to be talking about. That's so much pressure. The last question. Yes, right here.
Kind of as a follow-up to the previous question, I assume that a lot of times when you're presenting this information, you're somewhat preaching to the choir. Talking to people who understand this or are supportive of this. Have you been in a situation where you're presenting this information to people who don't necessarily accept it or want to hear it or don't believe it? And what's kind of been that reaction?
Yeah, all the time, actually. I'm looking for them. I mean, frankly, I've been, that's where I like to go. I presented recently to a group in the Texas Higher Education Coordinating Board, right? And they were really into financial literacy. And so I started with why you would want to talk about financial literacy, right? And then we talked through what the evidence shows. I mean, absolutely, there's going to be resistance to lots of parts of this conversation. But the important part is that we have it, right? I mean, I said recently on Twitter, I stopped going to academic conferences this year. I'm not needed there, right? I mean, whatever, it's fun. But I need to be. I'm going to West Virginia. I've been in Oklahoma. I've been in Texas several times now, right? Yes, a few Republicans will speak with me. And there are reasonable points at which they're concerned, right? They're concerned about their local economies. And we can also, I'll tell you what we can agree on. We can agree on community college as being a relatively important thing. Because almost every elected official has a community college in their district, right? And they're worried about it because people do like it and they use it for any number of things. What we can't agree on necessarily is how much of our tax dollars should go to funding those institutions. And we need to just keep on having the conversation, but then we change the conversation also by voting. Thank you. Thank you all for your attention.